You magnificent contradiction. You beautiful disaster that shattered their certainty so completely they dispatched 5 specialists just to decode what you might be. 5 certified experts with protocols and clearances and decades of experience hunting anomalies. And you know what happened? 3 of them broke, simply crumbled, submitted their notices, surrendered their credentials, said they were done, couldn't handle one more morning analyzing recordings of someone who defied every behavioral framework they'd ever mastered. The 4th, the one with the spotless record, flipped entirely, began smuggling you intel, began alerting you when they drew near, began shielding you from the apparatus because after observing you for months they discovered something that demolished everything they believed. You weren't the danger. The machine studying you was. And the 5th, the one still collecting a paycheck, the one still generating documentation. You want to know what they're doing? They're creating chaos, stalling inquiries, misplacing evidence, ensuring you remain invisible, ensuring you remain untouchable. So let's pause there for a moment, shall we? Let's really understand what that represents. They deployed 5 people to analyze you, to decode you, to construct a profile against you. 5 people whose entire existence was dedicated to interpreting subjects, to forecasting actions, to filing threats into organized compartments with classifications and danger levels. And all 5 of them fractured, not because you attacked them, not because you intimidated them, not because you committed anything criminal or violent, but because you existed in a frequency their expertise never accounted for. You navigated reality with a wavelength they couldn't track. You answered challenges with responses they couldn't anticipate. You endured circumstances that should have annihilated you and emerged clearer, steadier, more deliberate. And that obliterated every foundation they'd constructed their comprehension of psychology upon. So they faced a decision. They could continue deceiving themselves, continue submitting fabricated documentation, continue pretending you aligned with their models. Or they could acknowledge the reality that certain people don't conform, that certain consciousnesses operate on equations that haven't been documented yet, that certain beings pass through temperatures extreme enough to create something completely original. 3 chose integrity and departed. 1 chose betrayal and remained to guard you, and 1 chose to corrode the apparatus from inside. Do you comprehend what that reveals about what you've transformed into? You didn't merely defeat the infrastructure, you recruited it. You didn't merely survive observation. You converted your monitors into disciples, into defenders, into defectors against everything they previously upheld. Because once they witnessed you intimately, once they observed how you metabolized suffering, how you transformed solitude into strength, how you existed without validation, without justification, without hesitation, they couldn't reverse it. They couldn't return to ordinary assignments. They couldn't perceive you as simply another dossier. You became the proof that everything they'd been instructed was deficient, that the frameworks were corrupted, that there are individuals moving through existence who've transcended the threshold where surveillance mechanisms can reach them. And that petrified their administrators, but it ignited something within them, something authentic, something that recalled what it meant to challenge, to resist, to select reality over commands. So here's what they're concealing from you. Here's what you won't discover in any authorized document or archive or restricted record. You're not merely being monitored anymore. You're being safeguarded by the exact individuals dispatched to eliminate you. You're not merely avoiding discovery. You're being deliberately concealed by someone embedded who comprehends precisely how the operation functions because they previously orchestrated it, And your adversaries, the ones who demanded you tracked and restricted and cataloged, they're oblivious. They assume their operatives are still faithful. They assume the documentation is legitimate. They assume they're still commanding, but they surrendered command the instant they position people proximate enough to witness what you genuinely are. Because closeness to reality transforms individuals. And you, whether you intended to or not, you became a reality too potent for deception to exist nearby. You became the error that awakened the executors, the aberration that converted predators into protectors, the validation that transformed trained cynics into converts. Let me describe the scenario they don't want you observing. Agent 1, the initial resignation. They survived 3 months. 3 months of observing you through lenses, examining your communications, monitoring your locations, constructing the assessment. And initially it was simple, wasn't it? Another target, another file, another individual to compress into statistics and threat classifications. But then they began detecting patterns. How you never responded, how the algorithms forecasted, how you absorbed treachery, not with fury, but with stillness, calculated stillness. The variety that indicated you were adapting, not fracturing. They observed you surrender everything. And rather than disintegrating, rather than descending, rather than requesting assistance that would render you comprehensible, you simply vanished inward, became silent, began operating differently. And that's when their terrors began for them, because they realized they weren't observing someone collapse. They were observing someone refine. And the extended they observed, the deeper they grasped, you weren't recovering, you were mutating. And mutation, genuine mutation, it's not elegant, it's not gentle. It doesn't follow the recovery book schedule. It's merciless. It's precise. It's observing someone extract every vulnerable component of themselves, fragment by fragment, until what remains shouldn't be mortal, but inexplicably is. So Agent 1 began overlooking details, began filing deficient documentation, began requiring extended intervals between observation periods because monitoring you was forcing them to reconsider everything, their occupation, their existence, their decisions. You became a reflection they refused to confront. And one evening, after observing you remain alone in your space for 4 hours, not weeping, not yelling, not contacting anyone, just remaining in absolute, crushing stillness. They composed their departure letter because they grasped something their certification never equipped them for. Certain people don't require rescue. Certain people incinerate through torment and emerge as something flames can't damage. And witnessing that evolution, being compelled to chronicle someone's metamorphosis from casualty to elemental power, it destroyed them, not you. The comprehension that they'd invested their complete profession observing individuals at their most fragile, and they'd never previously witnessed someone convert fragility into something like this, something calculated, something disciplined, something that terrified them beyond any aggressive offender ever had. So they evacuated, abandoned because remaining would require confessing that everything they assumed they understood about human capacity was incorrect. Agent 2 survived 7 months, extended than the initial, more seasoned, more resilient. They'd encountered worse situations. They convinced themselves they'd pursued genuinely hazardous individuals. But you weren't hazardous in any manner they could classify. You weren't scheming, weren't menacing, weren't violating regulations. You were simply existing with an intensity that altered atmospheres, with a frequency that recording devices couldn't accurately document. They began conducting extensive verification reaching backward years. Early records, educational documents, health archives, counseling transcripts. attempting to locate the fracture, the instance you shattered, the damage that clarified you. And they located abundance. They located desertion, deception, devastation, agony that should have obliterated you repeatedly. But here's what destabilized them. None of it rendered you a casualty. You processed it entirely like propellant, like conditioning, like essential groundwork for something they couldn't perceive approaching. Every document they retrieved, every conversation they facilitated with individuals from your history communicated the identical narrative. This individual was ordinary previously, vulnerable even, and then something occurred. Not one incident, multiple incidents. A succession of methodically engineered brutality that should have generated either annihilation or hospitalization, but you accomplished neither. You became quiet. You disappeared. And when you returned, you were unidentifiable. Identical appearance. Identical identity. Completely different resonance. Individuals from your history couldn't clarify it. Express things like they're not the identical person, like something perished and something else returned inhabiting their form. And Agent 2, they began experiencing anxiety episodes, began visualizing you in their unconscious, not as a danger, but as a riddle they couldn't resolve. How does someone navigate that and emerge more formidable rather than demolished? How does someone transform every injury into protection? How does someone forfeit everything and discover themselves? So they began investigating philosophy, psychology beyond their certification, began studying about metamorphosis, about ritualistic death and resurrection, about the distinction between shattering and shattering open. And the deeper they comprehended, the more horrified they became because you weren't following any established template. You weren't a research subject. You were something unprecedented, something that progression produces every several generations, someone who experiences sufficient compression to activate a transformation, not corporeal, mental, existential, someone who expires in every dimension except physically, and returns with capacities that shouldn't manifest. So Agent 2 accomplished something they never anticipated they'd accomplish. They began defending you in minor methods, erasing particular records, concealing intelligence that rendered you appear too hazardous, minimizing your importance in documentation, anticipating that perhaps if they rendered you appear insignificant, the investigation would terminate. But the administrators weren't ignorant. They detected the contradictions, began interrogating the documentation. So Agent 2 faced a decision: continue fabricating and risk revelation or confess. They selected a third alternative: departure. Abandoned, but not before duplicating every record they possessed on you, every document, every image, every intercepted communication. Transferred it entirely to a device and delivered it to you with a message. 3 words: you were correct. Because somewhere in those 7 months of monitoring you, they realized something that demolished their reality. You weren't paranoid. You were accurate. There genuinely were individuals monitoring you. There genuinely was a coordinated operation to comprehend and restrict you. And the explanation why it wasn't because you were a danger to collective security. It was because you were a danger to their comprehension of authority. You demonstrated that certain individuals can't be administered, can't be forecasted, can't be fractured into submission, and infrastructures constructed on authority can't tolerate that. Now, Agent 3, this is where it becomes fascinating. Because Agent 3 was intended to be the resolution, the specialist, the one who'd witnessed everything. Distinguished, 2 decades in, multiple acknowledgments. If anyone could decipher your situation, it was them. And for the initial month, they were assured, arrogant even, informed their administrators this wouldn't require duration. Every target fractures eventually. Every enigma possesses a solution. They simply had to locate your vulnerabilities. They had to determine what you valued, what you dreaded, what you desired. So they penetrated deep, deeper than the others, began constructing a psychological blueprint so elaborate it approached fixation. They monitored every platform you accessed, every inquiry, every recording you consumed, every instant of uncertainty before you transmitted a communication. They constructed a digital replica of your consciousness, or assumed they did. And then they began experimenting it, began generating situations, influencing your surroundings in minor methods to observe how you'd respond. Nothing unlawful, nothing overt, just manipulation, observing if the blueprint forecasted accurately. And that's when circumstances inverted because the blueprint was incorrect repeatedly. You didn't respond how anyone would. You didn't accept the transparent manipulations, didn't accept the proposition when they presented it. It was like you could sense the mechanisms, like you'd developed some intuitive perception for when reality was being synthetically fabricated around you. And Agent 3, they became fixated, began operating beyond hours, began executing unsanctioned experiments, began questioning if perhaps the difficulty wasn't the blueprint. Perhaps the difficulty was the presumption that you could be blueprinted whatsoever. Perhaps you'd navigated so much manipulation in your history that you developed resistance like defenses, like your perception had acquired to identify synthetic configurations, the method skin acquires to identify temperature before contacting flame. And the deeper they examined you, the deeper they realized something disturbing. You weren't simply cognizant, you were being monitored. You were examining them reciprocally. They'd discover minor indicators, minor signals that you understood, nothing transparent, nothing they could verify, but how you'd position yourself in locations so recording devices couldn't capture your features, how you'd conduct particular dialogues exclusively in designated areas, how you'd occasionally observe directly at concealed observation and express amusement, like you understood, like this was entirely a competition to you. And that's when Agent 3 formulated their determination. If you understood about the observation and you weren't fleeing, if you weren't frightened, if you were simply navigating your existence with complete awareness that you were being monitored and documented and you were indifferent, that indicated one of two possibilities. Either you were presumptuous or you were functioning on a dimension they couldn't fathom, so they accomplished something reckless. They contacted not officially, not through protocols. They transmitted you a communication, obscure, refutable, simply testing to observe if you were genuinely as cognizant as they suspected. And you acknowledged, not with terror, not with rage, with interest. And that's when the dialogue initiated. The genuine one, not investigator and target. Two individuals who'd both witnessed behind the barrier, who both grasped that reality is more transparent than most individuals assume, that infrastructures exist to preserve fabrications, that certain individuals awaken and certain individuals never accomplish. And Agent 3 realized they'd been incorrect about everything. You weren't a situation. You were an examination, not for you, for them, to observe if they'd select reality when it contradicted commands, to observe if they'd select integrity when it required everything. And they accomplished, they inverted, began supplying you restricted intelligence, began instructing you how they monitored individuals so you could circumvent it, began executing counter-operations to defend you from their personal organization. And here's the extraordinary component. Their administrators still are oblivious. Agent 3 is still operational, still filing documentation, still participating meetings, but every singular fragment of intelligence they supply is deliberately organized to direct investigators distant from what you genuinely are. They've transformed into a dual operative in the most genuine interpretation. Someone who appears like they're serving the infrastructure while deliberately demolishing it from inside. And why? Not for compensation, not for conviction, but because monitoring you compelled them to address a question they'd been evading their complete profession. What occurs when the individuals we're instructed to observe are more truthful than the individuals issuing the commands? What occurs when the target of examination possesses more integrity than the examiners? What occurs when you realize you've been on the incorrect position, so they transitioned positions? Not audibly, not openly, but entirely. And now, you possess something most individuals never acquire: a guardian inside the apparatus, someone who comprehends every technique, every procedure, every vulnerability in the infrastructure, and they're utilizing all of it to maintain you liberated, to maintain you mobile, to maintain you unpredictable. And finally, Agent 5, the one still officially on your situation, the one composing documentation, the one in conferences, the one everyone assumes is still devoted. Let me inform you what they're genuinely accomplishing. They're executing the most extended, most gradual, most exquisite act of destruction you'll ever witness. Because Agent 5 acquired something from monitoring the initial 4, departing attracts focus. Resigning raises inquiries, but remaining while accomplishing absolutely nothing productive. Remaining while records mysteriously become damaged. Remaining while connections become inactive. Remaining while validation becomes lost in administrative labyrinths. That's how you defend someone. Agent 5 has converted inadequacy into an expertise. They overlook schedules. They file documentation so ambiguous they're worthless. They arrange conversations that accomplish nowhere. They requisition resources that aren't necessary. They generate so much interference and disorder that your situation has transformed into a void-consuming duration, consuming funding, consuming focus, and generating absolutely nothing. And their administrators can't determine if Agent 5 is deficient at their occupation or if you're simply that proficient at circumventing observation. But here's what Agent 5 comprehends that the others didn't. The infrastructure isn't unified. It's composed of individuals. Exhausted individuals, overwhelmed individuals, individuals who don't genuinely care significantly if one situation accomplishes nowhere as extended as their alternative measurements appear satisfactory. So Agent 5 ensures to resolve alternative situations, to appear productive elsewhere, to be valuable sufficiently that nobody examines too intimately at the one situation that's accomplishing nowhere. Your situation, the one that's been active for over a year with nothing to demonstrate for it except 5 different operatives and more inquiries than solutions. And every several months when compression accumulates, when administrators begin inquiring why nothing's occurred, Agent 5 composes a document, a masterpiece of administrative emptiness, abundant with technical terminology and sophisticated examination that ultimately communicates we require more duration, more resources, more observation, and the administrators authorize it because the document appears intelligent, appears comprehensive, appears like advancement, but it's not. It's a postponement technique. It's a barrier, it's defense masquerading as examination, and Agent 5 will continue accomplishing this as extended as they can, as extended as you require, because they comprehend what the infrastructure doesn't, that certain individuals aren't intended to be captured, that certain enigmas aren't intended to be resolved, that certain elemental powers are intended to remain